The equation that will increase your strength for calisthenics skills such as the planche and for whatever other strength sport you participate in is strength equals neural adaptations times muscle cross-sectional area. Now let's break it down so by the end of this video you'll know the exact fundamental strength principles you can apply to your training to obtain whatever dynamic and static skill such as the planche that you might want to obtain during your training. A lot of the information in this video is coming from research or this book, Overcoming Gravity by Stephen Lowe, a gymnastics coach, so none of this is bullshit. It's all fundamental strength principles that are backed by research. So if you're wondering, that's where it's coming from, and if you want any more insight, then you want to read this book. Now with that said, let's get started. The force output of a muscle, also known as strength, is determined by two factors, which are cross-sectional area of the muscle, which is basically how big your muscle is, so muscle size, and neural adaptations of your central nervous system. And this is probably the most important and what you are training when you're training strength. So when you're training strength, you're training your central nervous system. Strength is also determined by a few other factors such as the angle of insertion of a muscle to a joint as well as limb length, but these are things you can't really change, so there's not really much point in including these in the equation because there's not much you can do about them. So you can pretty much ignore these because, as you know, whether you're big, small, gymnast or a bodybuilder, you're still able to build huge amounts of strength, so you might as well not think about this. So for example, if you feel like you have really short arms and feel like you'll never get the front lever, this is a bad idea and you shouldn't have this mentality. There is one thing I'd like to note for this equation, and that is technique. If you're able to increase technique, you're able to increase how efficient you are at that particular movement, and that means less waste of energy, so a greater force output, which is strength. This is now why I want to explain to you guys the SAID principle. The SAID principle is specific adaptations to impose demand. All this means is if you apply enough stress to the muscles and central nervous system through intense exercise, then the body will adapt to this stress by increasing your strength and muscle hypertrophy, so you come back stronger and bigger. If you do this enough and over a long period of time, you'll cause large-scale changes to the body in terms of size and strength. And the method you use to do this is called progressive overload. Progressive overload is the addition or increase in stress to the body over time, so the body has to adapt in terms of muscular hypertrophy, strength, and muscle connective tissue integrity. So the SAID principle is the concept of adaptation to stress over time, while progressive overload is the increase of stress on the body to cause changes, which of course in practice is either putting more weight on the bar or making our body weight movements harder. Okay, so that's the SAID principle and progressive overload, and keeping that in mind, then we know that strength training is mainly focused on neural adaptations and increasing that. So if we increase our neural adaptations over time, we can increase our strength for calisthenics skills such as the planche and be able to hold it longer. But what we can also do is work on muscle size that will also help our strength for the calisthenic moves such as the planche. This is because the bigger a muscle is, then the bigger capacity it has for strength gains. So essentially, the bigger the muscle, the greater strength you could have. This is why in a strength program, usually you have a hypertrophy phase first, which is moderate intensity but higher reps, so you work on building that muscle. Then you go into a strength phase, which is going to be much higher intensity for lower reps, where you work on that neural adaptations. This is going to be really important when you come to making your own training programs, because you don't want to miss out either part of that equation. You don't want to miss out on the neural adaptations, which is the strength training, and you don't want to miss out on building muscle, because that will also help with your strength. But this brings into question the bodyweight muscle conundrum. The bodyweight muscle conundrum really relates to any athlete that relies on relative strength. In gymnastics, you need a lot of strength relative to your body weight. So does this mean if you keep gaining muscle and making your body weight go up, is your strength going to be negatively affected by this? And in the short, the answer is no. The more muscle you have, the bigger capacity you have for strength gains. So you shouldn't worry about putting on muscle or having hypertrophy phases in your program and it affecting your strength movements such as learning the planche. You only really should worry about putting on muscle when you get to that professional bodybuilder size, so where your mobility is severely reduced because of all the muscle mass on your frame. And this is really going to impede your strength performance when it comes to bodyweight movements. But unless you're taking androgynous steroids, then you're probably fine. You don't need to worry about gaining too much muscle. I will note that most people have a range or body weight that they're going to work best with, but for most cases, especially beginners, the more muscle you gain, the stronger you're going to be. And if you still don't believe me, look at me and the Barkage as examples. The Barkage has so much muscle on his frame, but he's still able to perform all the bodyweight movements because that muscle helps him with his strength. Same with me, I bulked out a bit, put on muscle, and I'm still able to perform all my strength movements because I really work on that neural adaptations in the strength phase of my program. So in short, don't worry about putting on too much muscle. You should prioritize both your strength and hypertrophy because these will both overlap and help your strength. And even Brandon Wynn, a gymnast, he also talked about this and agreed.
The same. I think you need hypertrophy to create strength.
Another expert in strength training, Dr. Mike Ezratali, I hope I'm saying that right, he's got a PhD in sports science and he also agrees with this statement.
Where people just try to stay skinny as long as possible and they don't have a ton of muscle. And someone's like, have you ever tried lifting and gaining muscle? Like, yeah, every time I gain weight, I get worse. It's like, well, yeah, temporarily you might get worse, but over the long term, as you build muscle and strength, months later, you might be about the same. And then you lose that excess fat and you used to be 60 kilos, now you're 65 and you're hitting your all-time best PRs. So some of that cyclicity is going to make you better over the long term. Basically, my big point here is in calisthenics, don't get complacent. Don't just assume your body weight's going to be whatever. Don't assume you're at the optimal body weight until you have good data to back that up.
He also explains why size or neural adaptations equals strength, so he also agrees with the equation.
Now, if you're more than 5 or 10 reps off of your goal, you're probably suffering from one of two things. One, major strength deficiency, and two, a major muscle size deficiency.
So now we know in strength training, we're really training our central nervous system and gaining those neural adaptations. So when we train our statics, like the planche, we're really working our neural adaptations and putting our body and central nervous system under stress. So now I'm going to explain a bit more about the central nervous system. So when you guys put a training plan together, you guys know what exactly is going on in the strength phase of your training program. First, okay, we're talking about the central nervous system. We need to know what motor units are. Motor units are just a nerve plus the muscle it innervates. Innervates is just a fancy name for stimulates. So a motor unit is just a nerve plus a muscle that it stimulates. So when your muscle fibers contract, this is done by a neuron or nerve, and this nerve plus the muscle contracting is called a motor unit. Now there are different types of motor units, but the only ones you need to know are low threshold motor units and high threshold motor units. LTMUs and HTMUs. LTMUs innervate slow twitch muscle fibers, and slow twitch muscle fibers are the fibers that are adapted to endurance sports. So if you're jogging, it's going to be your slow twitch muscle fibers that are contracting. HTMUs innervate fast twitch muscle fibers. These are more of the muscle fibers that are adapted for strength movements or high intensity sports. Fast twitch muscle fibers have the greatest potential for hypertrophy. So this means if we can activate the HTMUs over the LTMUs in our training, then we can gear our training towards hypertrophy, which we know the bigger muscles, that's going to help with our strength. Now you might be wondering, how do we activate those HTMUs over the LTMUs? And I'll talk about this more in another video, but just know that high intensity training, so heavy weights or really hard intensity bodyweight movements, that's going to trigger the HTMUs over the LTMUs. And there's different ways of doing this, different methods, but that's all you need to know for now. Okay, so now you know about motor units, but let's go back to the nervous system. How does the nervous system increase strength? Well, there are 6 ways that the nervous system can potentially increase your strength. The first method is called recruitment. That is an increase in the number of motor units being activated for a specific movement. Second method the central nervous system uses to increase strength is called the firing rate. This is a decrease in the time between each signal sent to the muscles, which increases the rate of contraction. Third method the central nervous system uses to increase strength is called intramuscular coordination. This is a decrease in the amount of time between motor units firing and working together. Next method is intermuscular coordination. This is how effectively timed the different contributing muscles of a movement are fired. So if you can fire all the muscles and muscle fibers at the same time, you're going to get more strength. Fifth method the central nervous system uses to increase strength is antagonistic inhibition. So this is a decrease in the resistance from the muscles opposite of those performing the movement. So imagine my bicep and my tricep. So if my bicep contracts, my tricep relaxes. If my tricep is not providing any resistance, then my bicep can contract harder. And the last and final method the central nervous system uses to increase strength is motor learning. This refers to the neural connections and programs within your brain that will affect your development of learning movements. So if your brain can really understand the movements and where your body needs to be for the planche, for example, then you're going to be stronger and be able to fire the correct muscles a lot easier. Don't worry if you didn't catch all that, you can always go back later, come back to this video, save it for later. I just thought it was really important to explain why the central nervous system is what we train in strength and how it increases our strength. Okay, so that's the central nervous system done. Without all the fancy biology, the minimal amount you need to know to why the central nervous system increases your strength. So now let's go back to hypertrophy. How can we really trigger hypertrophy, and what are the methods you can use in your training to trigger hypertrophy? There are 3 mechanisms that trigger hypertrophy: mechanical tension, eccentric damage, and metabolic accumulation. The mechanical tension pathway is triggered during really heavy or fast movements. This is because doing really high intensity, so heavy or fast movements, really triggers those HTMUs we talked about. So if we trigger a lot of HTMUs under high intensity or high stress, then the body is going to compensate and really put on muscle mass. The eccentric damage pathway triggers hypertrophy by analyzing and measuring time under tension. To trigger hypertrophy, intensity or the stress needs to be high enough, but also you need the weight or load to be light enough so you can do multiple repetitions to get into that rep range where you're building muscle and not strength. So if you only do 1 rep of something, you're not going to suddenly start building muscle, but if you do maybe 10 to 15 reps, then you're going to be in a rep range where you're going to start building muscle. By doing the repetitions over and over, you're accumulating stress, which the body recognizes, and then it compensates by putting on muscle. The last pathway, metabolic accumulation, explains why cyclists have really large quads, or even physical labor workers might have really large forearms from using a hammer all day. So although these are really light loads, so they're just pedaling a lot and doing a lot of repetitions, or a hammer is not too heavy but you're doing a lot of repetitions, this accumulates metabolites and stress markers, indicating to your body that there's a buildup of stress and you're using that muscle a lot for continual repetitions. So to compensate, the body triggers hypertrophy and puts on muscle so that area is safer. Now you know all the pathways the body uses to trigger hypertrophy, which we know helps with our strength when learning calisthenics skills. Okay, so there's one final strength principle I want to go over. Okay, so this strength principle is called Hyndman's size principle. This principle determines what exercises we want to select to do in our calisthenics program, and that's why it's important to know, because it really defines how we train. Hyndman's size principle. All this principle says is that motor units are recruited from smallest to largest. LTMUs are the smallest and HTMUs are the largest. So it takes less of a signal from your nerves to innervate the LTMUs. That's why they're low threshold motor units. HTMUs, the high threshold motor units, take a larger signal to really activate. So when we contract a muscle, the LTMUs activate first because they need a much weaker signal, and then once the signal increases in intensity, the HTMUs can then be activated. But when we do near max effort movements or lifts, such as the planche, that's going to be pretty max effort, the LTMUs and HTMUs activate at the same time because you get such a large neuro signal sent to the muscles to contract and hold yourself in that planche position. So what this means for strength and hypertrophy training is you want weight or bodyweight exercises that are intense and pretty difficult. This will ensure you activate HTMUs, which have the largest potential for hypertrophy and thus will help our strength. So you can still build muscle doing the planche or front lever or whatever static skill if you hold it long enough, because of that mechanical tension and metabolic accumulation that we talked about earlier that triggers hypertrophy. If you want me to dive deeper into how to build muscle using statics any further, then let me know down in the comments, and you guys know I'll make a video about that as well. And if you're enjoying this video, getting value out of it, just hit like for me. Okay, so literally the single reason why this equation is even important at all is because it determines how we program our training. If we have all this knowledge for how to get strong, but we don't actually get strong. It's pretty pointless. So what comes next is programming, and how you program your workouts to increase those neural adaptations and hypertrophy to build muscle and increase your strength. So I'm gonna have a full calisthenics programming skill guide coming out, and when that is out, I'm gonna put that here. But for now, watch this video. It's gonna be telling you why training to failure is gonna be killing your planche, and it's gonna be taking into account a lot of strength principles that you don't wanna miss. That's gonna be helpful for your program.